What started as a simple trip to Canada turned into the most humbling experience of his life, and it all began with one sentence he was absolutely confident he could say perfectly. He had practiced it for weeks. In his car, in the shower, even on Duolingo at 2 a.m. Bonjour, je parle français. Easy, smooth, impressive, at least that's what he thought. But the moment he stepped into a small café in Montreal and actually said it out loud, the silence that followed told him everything he needed to know. And trust me, that was only the beginning. Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, please subscribe, like my video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. Jake was the kind of American who believed preparation was everything. Before flying to Quebec, he had watched countless YouTube videos about learning French fast, read blog posts about expat life in Canada, and even bragged to his friends that he would blend right in. He didn't just want to visit Canada, he wanted to prove that Americans abroad could adapt. He told everyone, "How hard can French in Quebec really be? It's just French." That confidence would slowly evaporate over the next 72 hours. When Jake landed in Montreal, he immediately noticed something different. Yes, it was Canada. Yes, there were Tim Hortons and familiar brands. But the signs, all French. The announcements at the airport? Rapid, melodic French that sounded nothing like the slow, clear audio from his language app. This wasn't the Parisian French he'd practiced, this was Quebec French. Faster, more nasal, filled with slang. Still, he brushed it off. Culture shock in Canada? Not him. He was ready. The café incident happened within the first hour. He walked in, chest slightly puffed, determined to order entirely in French. The barista smiled politely and said, "Bonjour." Jake responded confidently, "Bonjour, je parle français." But instead of impressed nods, the barista replied with a full-speed sentence that sounded like one long word. Jake froze. His brain tried to separate the sounds. Nothing. He caught maybe avec and something that sounded like sucre. He panicked and blurted out, "Yes." The barista switched to English instantly. "What can I get for you?" And just like that, his grand plan to immerse himself in Quebec French collapsed in under 15 seconds. But that wasn't even the worst part. Determined not to give up, Jake decided the real problem was environment. "They switched to English because they hear my accent," he told himself. "I just need to sound more local." So he started practicing pronunciation obsessively. He watched videos explaining the difference between Quebec French versus France French. He learned that to sometimes sounds like "c'est le fun," means it's cool, and that dépanneur means convenience store. He memorized phrases. He felt smarter already. The next day, he walked into a small dépanneur to test his skills. The clerk, an older man with a strong Quebec accent, greeted him casually. Jake confidently asked, "Où est le dépanneur?" The clerk blinked. "Ben, t'es dedans. You're in it." Jake had just walked into the store and asked where the store was. He had mixed up his memorized phrases. His face turned red. The clerk chuckled softly. Not mean, just amused. That subtle embarrassment hit harder than open laughter. And then came the restaurant incident. Jake met a few locals at a social meetup event for expats in Canada. They encouraged him to practice French openly. "Don't worry," one woman told him. "We appreciate the effort." That gave him courage. So when the waiter came, Jake ordered entirely in French. Or at least, he tried. He wanted to say he was excited to try the dish. Instead of saying, "Je suis enthousiaste," he confidently said, "Je suis excité." The table went silent for half a second. Then someone coughed to hide a laugh. In Quebec French, just like in France, that word often has a different meaning. Jake had accidentally announced he was physically aroused by the food. He didn't realize until his new friend leaned over and gently corrected him. The humiliation hit slowly. He laughed it off, but inside he felt that creeping awareness every American abroad eventually faces. Maybe he had underestimated this entire experience. But here's where things escalated. Jake had applied for a short-term internship in Montreal, thinking learning French in Quebec would boost his resume. To his surprise, he got an interview. This was his chance to redeem himself. He prepared scripted answers in French. He rehearsed for hours. On the day of the interview, he walked in determined to prove he wasn't just another overconfident American. The interviewer began in French. Jake answered his first question flawlessly, or so he thought. Halfway through his second response, he blanked. The interviewer asked a follow-up question using informal Quebec slang. Jake caught none of it. Instead of asking them to repeat it, he smiled and gave a completely unrelated answer about teamwork. The interviewer paused. Je pense que tu n'as pas compris la question. I think you didn't understand the question. That sentence landed like a brick. For the first time since arriving, Jake admitted it out loud. Non, pas vraiment. No, not really. And something unexpected happened. Instead of dismissing him, the interviewer switched between French and English and explained the nuances of the Quebec workplace culture. They talked about how many Americans in Canada assume French is just a checkbox skill, when in Quebec, it's tied deeply to identity and history. That conversation changed the tone completely. This wasn't about embarrassing language mistakes anymore. It was about respect. Jake walked out without a job offer that day. But he walked out with something else. Perspective. Over the next week, he stopped trying to impress people. He stopped forcing complex sentences. He started listening more. When someone corrected him, he thanked them instead of defending himself. He began to understand that French-Canadian accent differences weren't wrong or weird, they were cultural expressions shaped by centuries of history. Ironically, the more humble he became, the more people stayed in French instead of switching to English. Shop owners appreciated his effort. A barista complimented his progress. At another restaurant, he successfully ordered an entire meal without accidentally declaring romantic feelings toward the dessert. But here's the twist. On his last night in Montreal, Jake was walking through Old Port when a tourist couple approached him. "Excuse me," they said in English. "Do you speak French? We're trying to understand this sign." Jake almost laughed. Just days earlier, he couldn't decode basic phrases. Now, he calmly translated the sign explaining parking restrictions. It wasn't perfect. He stumbled once. But he did it. And in that small moment, something clicked. Learning French in Quebec hadn't gone the way he imagined. It wasn't smooth. It wasn't impressive. It wasn't the cinematic montage he pictured. It was awkward, uncomfortable, and deeply humbling. But maybe that's exactly why it worked. Because culture shock in Canada isn't about being laughed at in a café. It's about realizing language is more than vocabulary. It's identity. It's pride. It's history. And when Americans abroad approach it with ego, they struggle. When they approach it with curiosity, doors open. So if you've ever tried learning a new language and completely embarrassed yourself, you're not alone. Drop your most awkward language mistake in the comments. I promise Jake's "Je suis excité" moment can't be topped. Or maybe it can. And if you're thinking about moving to Quebec or starting expat life in Canada, hit that like button and subscribe. Because stories like this happen more often than you think. Jake returned to the US different than when he left. He didn't come back fluent. He didn't come back with a job offer, but he came back with respect for Quebec French, a deeper understanding of Canadian culture, and a funny story that would follow him forever. And the next time someone says, "How hard can learning French in Canada really be?" he just smiles. Because now he knows. It's not about how hard it is. It's about how willing you are to be humbled. Just when Jake thought his adventure was over, Canada had one last surprise for him. On his final day in Montreal, he decided to explore a local farmer's market. Confident in his new skills, he approached a vendor selling maple syrup. "Bonjour, je voudrais un peu de sirop d'érable, s'il vous plaît," he said, perfectly enunciating each word. The vendor nodded, then asked a question, at lightning speed, throwing in Quebec slang Jake hadn't learned yet. For a split second, he panicked, but then he remembered his week of humility and listening. Instead of guessing, he laughed nervously and asked, "Pouvez-vous répéter, s'il vous plaît?" "Could you repeat that, please?" The vendor laughed warmly, repeating slowly, and Jake finally got it right. He paid, thanked the vendor in French, and walked away feeling unstoppable. Not because he had mastered the language, but because he had learned the value of patience, humility, and genuine effort. On his walk back, he overheard a group of tourists struggling to communicate in French, their frustration clear. Without thinking, Jake stepped in to help translate. It wasn't perfect, he stumbled over a few words, but the grateful smiles he received made him realize something.